For centuries, ordinary people, fishermen, traders, explorers, threw themselves into the terrifying, featureless expanse of the open ocean. They had absolutely no satellite safety nets. They relied entirely on wood, wind, and the absolute limits of human endurance. In this explainer, we're going to reconstruct the visceral reality of these ancient seafarers and discover exactly how they managed to map a world that was endless, uncharted, and frankly, actively hostile. So you really have to ask yourself, how did our ancestors survive the endless, featureless abyss of the open ocean without any modern technology? I want you to imagine for a second that you're standing on the pitching deck of a wooden vessel, totally swallowed by a uniform blue abyss. Salt spray is stinging your eyes, the wind is howling, and the horizon offers absolutely no landmarks. How do you find your way home? Well, the answer isn't found in the decrees of rulers, but in the everyday brilliance of ordinary people. People who actually transformed their own bodies into the world's most sophisticated navigational instruments. Section 1. Reading the Living Ocean, the Tactile and Sensory Mariner. Polynesian navigators were without a doubt absolute masters of the sea. Staring out into the pitch-black waters at night, they learned to recognize a phenomenon known as te lapa. Now, these were mysterious, straight-line bursts of bioluminescent light flashing just below the water's surface. To the ancient voyager, this underwater glow wasn't some kind of magic. It was a vital, natural directional beacon radiating directly from distant, hidden land masses. And you know, this brilliance actually extended to mapping the water itself. Polynesians crafted these incredible stick charts from coconut fronds and cowrie shells to represent islands and ocean swells. But here is the crucial part. These charts were never taken to sea. They were purely instructional. A navigator would meticulously memorize the map, leave it ashore, and then literally lie prone or crouch in the hull of their canoe. They physically felt the pitch and roll of the vessel, matching the muscular memory of the wood's movement to the swell patterns they'd studied. They were quite literally feeling the invisible landscape of the ocean. Meanwhile, for Western sailors navigating coastal waters, well, if you couldn't see the land, you had to feel the bottom of the ocean. They did this through a process called arming the lead. Sailors would hollow out the base of a bell-shaped 5-kilogram lead weight and pack it with sticky tallow or animal fat. When they dropped this heavy lead line into the deep to measure the depth in fathoms, it would actually retrieve a sample of the ocean floor. Navigators would then smell, feel, and sometimes even taste the retrieved mud, sand, or crushed shells to figure out exactly where they were hovering. To give you an idea of how this worked in practice, a 14th century sailing direction instructs mariners to, and I quote, "Go north until ye sound in 72 fathoms in fair gray sand. Then go north until ye come into soundings of ooze." I mean, this brilliantly illustrates the sensory geognosy of the sea. Ordinary sailors were building a massive, mental, topographical map of a world they couldn't even see. They were blindly feeling their way through the deep, relying entirely on the texture of sand and ooze to keep their ships off deadly rocks. Section 2. Navigating by the Heavens, the Visual and Celestial Ocean. Looking upwards, the Polynesians achieved a frankly grueling intellectual feat known as the star compass. And actually, this wasn't a physical object at all. It was a mental construct that divided the entire visual horizon into 32 distinct houses, where specific celestial bodies rise and set. A master wayfinder had them memorize the precise rising and setting arcs of over 150 individual stars. So, as the night progressed and stars naturally rotated out of view, the navigator fluidly shifted their reference point from one star to the very next. It was this incredible intergenerational legacy of astronomical genius, passed down through oral chants, that truly allowed them to conquer the vast Pacific. European mariners, however, really struggled with the severe physical constraints of their early celestial tools. To find latitude using the sun, sailors wielded a cross staff. But there was a major catch. It required staring directly into the blinding solar glare, which understandably caused agonizing eye damage and eventual blindness. It actually wasn't until 1594 that an English sea captain named John Davis invented a brilliant sight-saving solution called the backstaff. This allowed the navigator to measure shadows with their back turned completely away from the sun. It's just a stark reminder of how the brutal physical realities of life at sea constantly drove technological innovation. Section 3. The Mechanics of Latitude. Calculating the Abstract Globe. Now, to survive the open ocean, you fundamentally had to know your speed and direction. This necessity led to a practice known as dead reckoning. Basically, you estimate where you are today based on exactly where you were yesterday, combined with your estimated speed and heading. But the constraints here are just terrifying. It's inherently dangerous because a single minor error in guessing your speed compounds fatally over time. If you miscalculate by even a tiny fraction, days later you could find your ship shattering against an uncharted reef in the middle of the night. So to make this guesswork a bit more accurate, sailors relied on something called the chip log. They would drop a wooden board attached to a rope over the stern of the ship, and this rope featured knots tied at very precise intervals. As the ship moved forward, a sailor held a sandglass, physically counting how many knots slipped through their calloused hands in a set amount of time. You know, this grueling physical labor is the exact reason maritime speed is still measured in knots today. And to chart all this progress, the world desperately needed a new kind of map. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator completely revolutionized global travel. He used complex calculus to create a map where rhumb lines, which are lines of constant compass heading, appeared as perfectly straight lines. This meant a sailor could just draw a straight line on the map, set their compass, and sail. But this mathematical convenience came at a massive visual cost, wildly inflating the size of landmasses near the poles. I mean, on this projection, Greenland looks the size of South America, when in reality, it's smaller than the Arabian Peninsula. But for the exhausted navigator, that distortion just didn't matter. What mattered was that the math kept them alive. Section 4. Mastering Longitude and Time, the Final Frontier of Navigation. So the absolutely crucial point here is this. Longitude, your exact east-west position on the globe, is fundamentally a measure of time. To know your longitude, you have to know the exact time at a fixed reference point, like Greenwich, England, compared to your local time at sea. But the physical constraints of a 17th century ship made this virtually impossible. Think about it, pendulum clocks simply cannot function on a violently rocking, wildly humid, salt-sprayed vessel. And without accurate clocks, even the greatest explorers were sailing essentially blind on the east-west axis. And this wasn't just some abstract academic puzzle. The death toll was staggering. In 1707, a British Royal Navy fleet totally misjudged their longitude and shattered against the rocky Isles of Scilly. Over 1,000 sailors drowned in a single night. This catastrophic loss of life sent absolute shockwaves through the empire and sparked a frantic global race to conquer time itself. Because of disasters like that, the stakes were raised to an astronomical level. In 1714, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, offering a massive prize of £20,000 to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to several $1 million today. At the time, the greatest scientific minds of the era, including Sir Isaac Newton himself, believed a mechanical sea clock was practically impossible. They heavily favored incredibly complex astronomical charts instead. We'll enter John Harrison. Now, he wasn't a lord, and he wasn't some elite university-trained astronomer. He was an ordinary working-class carpenter and a self-taught clockmaker. Yet, Harrison dared to challenge the academic establishment. He proposed a purely mechanical solution that completely defied the conventional wisdom of the era's greatest scientific minds. It's honestly a stunning piece of social history, a solitary craftsman using the practical, everyday knowledge of his trade to solve a problem that had totally baffled the world's most famous scientists. Over several decades, Harrison engineered a series of pioneering marine timekeepers. In his first attempt, known as the H1 chronometer, he completely discarded the traditional pendulum. Instead, he used two large, interconnected brass dumbbell balances linked by springs. Because they counter-oscillated, meaning they swung in opposite directions, they beautifully neutralized the violent pitching and rolling of the ship. Completely unaffected by salt, extreme changes in temperature, or rolling waves, Harrison had effectively isolated time from the chaos of the sea. He rendered the motion of the vessel totally irrelevant to its frequency. John Harrison's chronometer forever changed humanity's relationship with the globe. By mastering time, we finally, truly mastered the boundless ocean. What was once a terrifying, unknowable abyss was transformed into a navigable, predictable highway. This breakthrough allowed for the safe mapping and the interconnected global trade of the modern world we know today. So, when we look back at these ancient mariners, the Polynesians crouching in the hulls of their canoes, the Western sailors tasting the mud of the seafloor, and ordinary carpenters building clocks to tame the ocean, we aren't just looking at the history of tools, we are looking at the ultimate story of human survival. They mapped the globe using only wood, shadows, and the stars, leaving a legacy of resilience against the endless horizon. The next time you pull out a map app on your phone, just ask yourself, would you have had the courage to step out onto that pitching wooden deck and sail blindly into the absolute unknown?